Continuing with our daily Gemara, we are in Sanhedrin, Daf Kuf Yud Beis Amud Beis 112b. We discussed last time at considerable length, complicated pilpul, complicated back and forth in the analysis in the Gemara with respect to different categories of property that belongs to those in an Ir Hanidachas in a castaway city, which ordinarily property of those who live in a castaway city, in the city that has been subverted and redirected to the service of idol worship. Ordinarily property of people who live in the city are destroyed, with the exception of property belonging to people of that city that has been consecrated to the temple or for a holy purpose. And because it's for a holy purpose, it's no longer qualified as property of people in the city. And we discussed the varying degrees of different types of property, different types of dedication to the temple, whether it's for the altar, lower holiness for offerings in the altar, which according to Rish Lakish, the owner still retains some ownership, and therefore it has to be let to die because it cannot be offered on the altar, because the owners have died. The owners of the offerings have died because they're members of, they're wicked people of the castaway city who are put to death, and therefore their offering cannot be offered in the temple, in the altar, and yet it cannot be destroyed together with the rest of the property because it's already been consecrated. It's in this limbo state, and you can't even redeem it for cash according to this view, and use the cash to go to the holiness, to go to the altar, because the original owner still retains some level of ownership, and because they still retain some level of ownership, it's, at least in that degree, part of the property of the castaway city, and thus has to be destroyed. And then we're going to skip some of the other details because they're not so important for the Gemara going forward now. And then we have the view of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon said, the verse says behemta, the animals of the city have to be killed. V'loi, we'll look at the actual words in the Gemara. The line begins with the word ishtini, the second word is ishtini, it's in the middle of the page, and then there's the colon. Rabbi Shimon says behemtacha, the verse says, or behemta actually, the animal of that city shall be killed. V'loi behemis b'chayr meiser, but not animals that have never belonged to anybody in the city. And those are the only animals in Rabbi Shimon's view which are not destroyed as part of the city, or at least get away scot-free. What happens to other levels of consecration? According to Rabbi Shimon, what happens to animals dedicated to be on the altar? What happens to animals donated to the upkeep of the house? That will come in a moment. But Rabbi Shimon is saying that the only animals that are excluded from the law of being killed as part of the Ir Hanidachas are animals that never belong to the members of that city. Namely, an animal that's the firstborn, and just by the dint of the fact that it's firstborn, it goes to the temple. And number two is meiser, the 10th animal. A person has a bunch of sheep and the flock walk through a archway. The 10th one automatically becomes holy. So because it's not elected, I want to give this away, it happens automatically. Therefore, it's never belonged to the individual who lives in the castaway city, and therefore it completely belongs to the holy, belongs to the mitzvah, and therefore is not destroyed, is not killed as part of the law of the castaway city. That is Rabbi Shimon's statement. Here comes the Gemara's analysis. The Mayaskinon. What are the circumstances of this animal that was either firstborn or the 10th animal that automatically belongs to the mitzvah, belongs to the holy, and thus does not belong to the member of the castaway city, and therefore is protected and does not get killed under the guise of the law of the castaway city? So, what kind of animal is this? Ilema, if you're going to suggest, bitmimin, we are talking about complete and whole animals that are fitting to actually be brought on the altar. If it's a whole animal and it's fitting to be brought on the altar, shalal shamayim, it's property of heaven. And therefore, you don't need the verse, behemta, that only the animals belonging to the city get killed rather than animals that are born or naturally or automatically consecrated to heaven. You don't need to rely on that verse, on that word in the verse, the word behemta, the word its animal. You can rely on the fact that the verse says the property of belonging to the city gets destroyed, and not property belonging to heaven. And if this is a wholesome animal which is going to be offered on the altar, it belongs to heaven. You don't need the verse. In other words, the question the Gemara is asking is not a question of law. The law is the wholesome animal that's firstborn, or the wholesome animal means has no blemishes and therefore it's fitting for the altar, or the wholesome animal, which is going to be the tenth animal, belongs to the altar and therefore doesn't get destroyed as part of the castaway city. But the question is, why do you need the verse behemta? It's animals, the animals belonging to the city, to the exclusion of animals that are going on the altar. Seemingly, animals that are automatically going to the altar are already excluded by dint of the fact that the verse says property of the city. Shlala, its property gets destroyed, and not property that belongs to heaven, which these animals are property belonging to heaven. And therefore, there's no need for the extra verse, behemta, to teach us that law. It's animal to teach us that law. Okay, so Ella rather, the Baalei woman must be talking about firstborns that are blemished, or the 10th animal which is blemished. So if it's blemished, it's no longer fit to be offered on the altar. It's no longer fitting to the altar. And if it's not fitting to the altar, it's the property of the original owners. And if it's the property of the original owners, then it should be destroyed with the rest of the castaway city. Shloloninu, it's the property of the city. So the question becomes, this statement of Rabbi Shimon, which takes the word behemta, the animals belonging to the city get destroyed to the exclusion of what? Its animals, and not animals what? Not animals that belong to heaven. Namely, the firstborn and the animals that are the 10th animal. If those animals are wholesome, unblemished, and fit for the altar, then you don't need the verse behemta, its animals, to exclude that. Just by the very fact that it's not the property of the city, already tells us that these animals are not to be destroyed. Now, if it's blemished animals, and therefore it's not fit for the altar, then it remains the owner, remains in the ownership, remains the property of the original owner who lives in the castaway city, then it should be destroyed. So what's this case? What's the story of Rabbi Shimon's statement telling us a special, unique law? That because the verse says behemta, because the verse says its animals, the animals belonging to the city get destroyed, and not animals of a firstborn, not animals of the 10th animal to walk through. What type of animals are those that require this special verse to exclude it from being destroyed with the rest of this property of the castaway city? So Amar Ravina says, La'ilam will settle on the fact that truly, Baalei mumen, it's talking about animals that are blemished, unfit to be offered on the altar. Now, if it's unfit to be offered on the altar, then seemingly it remains the property of the original owner, who's a member of the castaway city. And if that's the case, seemingly these animals should be destroyed, just like every other part of the property of that city. Says Ravinu, no. Rav Shimon is telling us a unique law. Only an animal which the owner gets to retain by dint of the fact that it's his animal. That is the kind of animal which the Torah says to be killed if it's part of the castaway city. Yatsu elu, this is to the exclusion of those that they are not eaten under the auspices of being your own personal property, but rather under the guise of being a firstborn and being a 10th animal. The shalosh shamayim, that it belongs to heaven. What it means is like this. Rabbi Shimon is telling us, even though a blemished firstborn or a blemished 10th animal remains in the ownership, under the ownership of the original owner, it's not fit for the temple. But nonetheless, given the fact that it was born first, and given the fact that this is the 10th animal, it automatically gets holiness. And therefore, even though the original owner gets to keep it and eat it, he eats it not as his own property, but he eats it as an extension of it being a firstborn and being a 10th animal, which is essentially holy, but the Torah allows you to eat it. The way Rashi frames it is something like this. Rashi says like this: an ordinary animal belonging to the firstborn, to the city of the castaway, a castaway city. What would you say? You say that's an animal of someone who lives in a castaway city. That's it. But when you're talking about a firstborn from someone in the castaway city, what are you going to say about it? Oh, that's a firstborn from the castaway city. But the very fact that you add that name, firstborn, indicates to you that it still retains some level of holiness, even though you get to eat it and keep it. An amazing idea. And therefore, says Rabbi Shimon, even though you get to eat it, even though it's private property of the owner, the original owner, and does not fit for heaven because it's a blemished animal, it's not wholesome, it's not fit for the altar, nonetheless, it still does not get destroyed with the rest of the property of the castaway city because it's not being eaten by you as an individual. It's being eaten by you under the guise of it being a firstborn, or under the guise of it being a holy animal. The Gemara says, Upliga. Ravina, who made this distinction in Rabbi Shimon's view between an animal that is wholesome, an animal that's fit for the altar, and that animal certainly belongs to the altar and therefore does not get destroyed as part of the castaway city. Whereas an animal which is blemished, a firstborn animal which is blemished, or a 10th animal which is blemished, even though you get to keep it, there's a special law from Rabbi Shimon, which is that even though you get to eat it as your own property, you get to eat it under the guise of it being holy, and therefore you need a special verse to tell you that it does not get destroyed with the rest of the property of the castaway city. This distinction, Pliga de Shmuel, is in disagreement with the Shmuel. Shmuel does not make this distinction. So if Shmuel doesn't make this distinction, how does he resolve the issue of what Rabbi Shimon is talking about? If the animal doesn't belong either way, if the animal you get to eat it, then you get to eat it. It belongs to you, and therefore, if this is from a member of the castaway city, it's got to be destroyed. And if it's to the altar, then it belongs to the altar and doesn't get destroyed. Why does Rabbi Shimon need to have this special teaching from the word behemta? So it says Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon said, "Hakol karev, hakol nifta." Rabbi Shmuel, says that Rabbi Shimon is making a principle of all that is offered and all that is redeemed. What does this mean? My karma, what's he saying? Hach karma, this is what he means to say. I'll translate the words literally, and then I'm going to go to Rashi on the side, because there's no way to understand it without the Rashi. I mean, any Gemara can't be understood without Rashi properly, but certainly the Gemara we're about to read now. I'll try my best. My karma, what's Shmuel saying? Hach karma, this is what Rabbi Shmuel means to say. Kol shekardev keshutam, anything that is ordinarily brought on the altar, if it is a complete and wholesome animal, unblemished, v'nifta, and ordinarily would be redeemed. We explained yesterday what redeemed was. Keshu balmum, if it's a blemished animal, mishlola imite, is excluded from being burnt as part of the castaway city from the fact that the verse says it's property and not property belonging to heaven. V'chol shohu karev, shekarev keshutam, and anything which ordinarily would be offered on the altar as a wholesome, unblemished animal. The einin nifta keshuhu balmum, and if that animal were to be blemished, it does not get redeemed. It rather remains the property of the original owner. Going, for example, b'chor or meiser, for example, the firstborn, or the 10th animal, which if it's full, wholesome, unblemished, it's fit for the altar, gets offered on the altar. If it's blemished, it remains the property of the original owner. Then the behema nafka, that's derived from the word behema. Okay, so what does this mean? Let's see Rashi. So you look on the left side, 3 lines from the top of the page, you'll see the bold word ma'ika amar halchik amar. This is Rashi quoting the Gemara. This is explained to this. Kol shu karev l'gavaya keshuhu tam. Anything, ordinarily, forget a castaway city for a moment. The law of this offering is such that if the animal is wholesome, it's offered on the altar, and when that animal encounters and acquires a blemish, and therefore now it's unfit for the altar, and therefore tzarech b'tiyah, the owner, given the fact that this animal, he still has responsibility, he still bears responsibility for it, even though he consecrated it to the altar. But now that it's unfit for the altar, and he bears a responsibility for it, therefore he has to redeem it, and the money is given to the altar, or bought another animal to go to the altar. Going, for example, shar kachim kalim, other offerings on the altar that are of a minor holiness. We mentioned in yesterday's class that there are some offerings in the altar that are called kachim kachim, higher level of sanctity, higher level of holiness. And then there are kachim kalim, animals offered on the altar that are of a lower status of holiness, without getting into what they are and how they are. But there are these two categories. And we also mentioned yesterday that Shimon's view is that kachim kalim, animals of a lower holiness, the original owners will still retain some ownership, and therefore be chayiv b'charisin, is responsible for it. And therefore, if the animal died, or if there was a blemish that happened to this animal, and it's no longer fit for the altar, the person who consecrated it must replace it and redeem it for cash value, and that money is then used to buy another offering. Chutz, with the exception of Meiser Behema, the 10th animal, Ubchar, and the firstborn. And therefore, Hanu, these animals that are of a lower holiness, which the general rule would be under ordinary circumstances if it's not from a castaway city. The rule would be that if it's a wholesome animal, it gets offered on the altar. But if it encounters a blemish, if a blemish happens to it, then the owner has to redeem it. Then that mishlola nafka, that is if that is excluded from the general rule of being burnt with a castaway city from the word shlola, its property. These aren't destroyed. These animals imo with the rest of the city. Because these animals have to be redeemed, we call this the property of heaven, because I'm always going to be paying out for it to make it go to heaven. It's a bit different than the way we argued yesterday, but this is the point here. And therefore, this would be in distinction to the first view in the Mishnah. This is Rabbi Shmuel explaining Rabbi Shimon. With the first view was kachim kalam bailamhum. The first opinion in the Mishnah was that animals that have been consecrated to the temple, to the altar, they are left. We speed up its process of death. That was one view. Whereas Rabbi Shimon, according to Shmuel, would be saying no, because these are animals that are redeemed, and therefore it means that this property has to make it to the altar, and therefore the owner, even though he has some ownership, because he has to replace it, but because he's replacing it, it's going to the altar. Therefore, he has no right to it. He has no benefit to it. He has to pay out to it, and therefore belongs to the altar. And therefore, no, we don't let it die of natural causes, like you said the first opinion of the Mishnah was, but rather these animals are not destroyed because it's not considered property of the Ir Hanidachas, not considered property of the castaway city, because the member who donated it would have, in theory, had to pay out for it, even if it incurred a blemish. But anything which ordinarily would be offered on the altar if it's wholesome, if it has no blemish and it's fit for the altar. But if it incurred a blemish, if it did get a blemish, and now it's no longer fit for the altar, now what happens to it? It's not redeemed. It remains the actual ownership of the original person who donated it. Ella rather nechel bailim, it's eaten by the owners. Going, for example, b'chor, the firstborn, u'maiser, and the 10th animal, halhu, then that lav sholosh shemayim mikru. It's not considered property of the holy. Afilu b'tamusan, even when it's a complete wholesome animal, and it would have been offered on the altar because it's a complete wholesome animal. Nonetheless, we are not going to say that it belongs to heaven. Why is it not belong to heaven? Because if in theory you were to encounter a blemish, you wouldn't have to redeem it, you would have to eat it your own, which means you keep it. Which means, therefore, even when it's offered on the altar, it still doesn't truly belong to the altar, it belongs to you. Because had it gets a blemish, it would come back to you. Following? In other words, Rabbi Shimon, whereas Rabbi Ravina earlier made a distinction between animals that are wholesome and go to the altar, okay? And then there are animals that are blemished, and you get to eat them. Talking about these two, the firstborn and the 10th. If it's wholesome, it goes to the altar. If it's blemished, you eat it. And there's the distinction according to Ravina. And Ravina therefore said that when it's blemished and you eat it, you're eating it under the guise of it being holy and that it's a firstborn or it's a 10th animal. Shmuel is saying no. From the very fact that you can eat it when it encounters a blemish is proof that even when it doesn't have a blemish and it goes to the altar, it doesn't truly belong to the altar. Because if it truly belonged to the altar, then when, like other animals, like other offerings, you have to replace it when it hit a blemish. Therefore, it's the behemta. And therefore, according to Shmuel, animals that are firstborn and animals that are the 10th animal, which according to Shmuel, even if it were a wholesome animal that were brought to the altar, it still doesn't belong to the altar, it belongs to the original owner. Proof being that if it were to encounter a blemish, you would eat it on your own. Therefore, it cannot be excluded from the law of the castaway city merely by the fact that the verse says only property of the castaway city gets burnt, because this isn't property of the castaway city. It requires a special verse, a special word, and therefore Shmuel says behemta. The word behemta, it's animals. Animals belonging to the castaway city. Those are the animals that get burnt, but not animals that are 10th or firstborn, even though they belong to you. So let's recap two versions of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon said that there's a special law, there's a special word in the verse, behemta. It's animal. Animals belonging to the castaway city get destroyed, rather than animals that belong to, rather than firstborn and 10th. So there's a unique verse just to exclude firstborn animals and 10th animal from being destroyed the rest of the castaway city. And the question is, why does it require a special verse when seemingly, just by the very fact that it's not property of the castaway city already means that it shouldn't be destroyed with the rest of the castaway city? So we have two ways. Yes, indeed, according to Ravina says, indeed, firstborn and a 10th animal does not belong to the individual, and therefore it doesn't get destroyed at the castaway city. But that's only true if it's wholesome and fit for the altar. If it's unfit for the altar, it's blemished, and the owner gets to eat it. So you might have thought, hey, it should also get destroyed with the castaway city because it belongs to the owner, he gets to eat it. And therefore there's a special verse, behemta, it's animal. No, that to exclude the firstborn and the 10th from being destroyed with the rest of the castaway city. That's Ravina's path of explaining Shimon, where he makes a distinction between wholesome and unwholesome animals. Shmuel says, no. Indeed, property that belongs to the altar, we know it doesn't get destroyed with the castaway city because it doesn't belong to the castaway city. And the verse says only things which belong to the castaway city. But that's only true if it truly belongs to the altar. How do I know if something truly belongs to the altar? I know it truly belongs to the altar if, hypothetically, it were to get a blemish, would you have to pay out for it? If you have to pay out for it and replace it, that means it truly belongs to the altar. But if you get to keep it when it gets a blemish, that means even when it's wholesome, it doesn't belong to the altar, truly it belongs to you. And therefore you might have thought that it should be destroyed with the castaway city, even if it's wholesome, because it belongs to the individual. Because hypothetically you would eat it for it to get a blemish. Therefore there's a special word behemta, therefore there's a special word, therefore Rabbi Shimon says, the special word behemta, it's animal. The animals belonging truly to the castaway city get to be destroyed, but not the firstborn and not the 10th animal, which, even though it were to be offered on the altar, were to be a wholesome, but it doesn't truly belong to the altar, and therefore it requires a special word in the verse to exclude it. I hope that was somewhat clear, and we thank Chaim for being cooperative today. Have a wonderful day, everybody.